So it's my pleasure to introduce now another youth leader, Pelumi Fadare. Pelumi is currently earning her master's in global human development at Georgetown University. Previously, she worked with the Spanish Embassy in Brussels under the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. Pelumi is currently supporting the World Bank in the Agriculture and Food Global Practice on the analysis of food security implications of COVID-19. Additionally, she is working with the International Finance Corporation to support their infrastructure and natural resources sustainable advisory teams' work on youth engagement and community development. Pelumi is passionate about youth development and civic spaces and is one of the founding members of a youth consultancy firm, UBUNTU, working with INGOs and a co-design team for Civicus and Plan International. Pelumi's research during the Youth Leadership Program investigated the relevant stakeholders involved in the creation of civic spaces for youth through storytelling and co-creation workshops. She worked with 12 youth activists from Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. With that, please welcome Pelumi to share more insights from her work.
Okay. Can you hear me? Okay, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining. I would like to start by acknowledging the support from the Center for International Private Enterprise CIPE for the support they've provided in this research. This research also received valuable contribution from dialogue and exchange of ideas with a diverse cohort of 12 youth grassroots activists leading social and political movements in very difficult circumstances. I would like to go into my presentation now, titled Shrinking Civic Space for Young People. Yes, so in my presentation today, I would like to discuss the following point: give you viewers a better understanding of civil society, provide a definition of what shrinking civic spaces, give a better understanding of the role of youth activism. Then I will go into discussing my methodology, findings of the research, and key takeaways. I was keen on conducting this research due to my previous experience working with international NGOs and civil society organizations, especially in projects related to grassroots and youth activists in the Global South. And what is currently happening is that, we understand that civil society organizations, including youth organizations, play a fundamental role in promoting basic human rights and democracy, as well as safeguarding against oppressive and anti-democratic regimes. And for me, this research was really important because youth activists are amazing and powerful change makers. They advocate, they mobilize for just an equal world. However, we see that their strive for social change in their communities and countries is being oppressed, which is due to the shrinking of civic space. And in the past years, young activists have witnessed a persistent silencing of their voices. Thus, there's been a narrowing of civic space available to them. And also we can see a big global trend of pushing back against democracy, human rights revolving around anti-democratic tendencies. And young people, especially youth activists, are facing hostile conditions and challenges as it comes to realizing their work in safeguarding democratic principles. Next slide, please. So therefore, to provide a better understanding of what this research really wanted to go towards, I will provide two definitions of what civic space actually means. According to Civic Space Watch, a civic space is the political, legislative, social, and economic environment which enables citizens to come together, share their interests and concern, and also act collectively to influence and shape society. Also, civic space is vital for healthy democracy, strong and socialist, and safeguarding the rule of law. Civicus similarly recognizes civic space as the bedrock of any open and democratic society. Basically, if there is an open civic space and civil society are able to organize, participate, and communicate without any hindrance, this would enable us to be able to hold our government accountable and also protect the rights and the rights of citizens. So as we can see, both definitions basically allow us to understand that An open civic space and strong civil society is essential to safeguard the rule of law and keeping government accountable towards its citizens. Basically, civil society allows that avenue for dialogue between a diverse range of group of people in the society, especially minorities and marginalized and at-risk groups, with other stakeholders, be it political representatives or people that are decision makers. Next slide, please. Yes, another important definition I wanted to explain today is the idea of the phenomenon of shrinking civic space, which is explained, among other things, as a situation in which civil society is seen as a threat to government, and therefore what government does is to hamper the work of civil society organization, either through policies and making it difficult for civil society organizations to act and to create changes they want to see in society. Next. Now that we understand what shrinking space is and also what civil society is, I wanted to go more into why actually the shrinking civil space matter and why it's important, right? What we can see is there is a lot of limited democratic space for civil society to influence, with restrictions to legal and regulatory framework, and also reductions of transparency, freedom, and liberty. And this is what really my research focused on. So in the next slide, I'm going to explain my research and methodology. Next slide, please. Thank you. So what I did over the summer was to conduct a case study research in 5 countries: Nigeria, Ghana, South Africa, Zambia, and Zimbabwe. I brought together a collective of strong 12 youth activists leading movements and working in very difficult circumstances in their countries and community. And the purpose of this was to conduct 2 workshops and to collect data through storytelling and co-creation workshop to basically understand lived experience and issues that young activists face when it comes to realizing their work in their communities and in their countries. Next slide, please. So basically, the idea of a storytelling workshop is to allow these activists to explain their experiences, the challenges they face, and then the co-creation workshop was created to allow them to have a space, a safe space where they could explain what solutions they think could be used to solve the issues they face, what are the gaps in safeguarding mechanisms, and what issues they face as it relates to funding the work they do. Next slide, please. So the research question focused on this following point. I wanted to understand what are the common risks and scenarios that youth activists face when it comes to shrinking civic space in their countries. The other one was to understand the critical gaps as it relates to how do we create a safety environment for young activists to work. And the last was to understand what funding mechanisms exist, what are the gaps or resources that exist for young people as they conduct and in face of this enclosed civic space. The next slide, please. So some of the questions that I asked were related to understanding the root causes of friction, who are the agents, who are the people that are in this restrictive civic space for young people, understand what is the role of the government and how the government influences youth activists and the work they can do. And this was interesting because the case study countries that I selected for Nigeria or South Africa or Zambia, we can see that these countries are starting to be not only restrictive, but also, for example, in Nigeria since 2015, there's been a continuous crackdown on social and political critics. A tipping point for youth activism was, last year in October, to demonstrate the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, known as SARS, and the End SARS movement, which was very vibrant to see how young people were very ready to demonstrate and to fight for their rights. And of course, we could see the oppressive and repressive measures that the government took against them. Another one is also in South Africa, where young people and civil society have always been at the forefront of demonstrating and fighting for the rights of the underprivileged and the citizens of Abuja elected political servants. Next slide, please. So I will go now into the findings of the research. Thank you. So, based on the engagement with the young people in the two workshops, the findings that we got to were basically like political instability is one of the big issues or root causes for shrinking of civic space, hindrance for the work they do. So basically, whenever it comes to them operating on the ground or trying to engage in their civil society work, they face a lot of interference from government, which then leads to shrinking of the scope of the work they would like to do, either through the government being very oppressive or even arresting them or just making their work very difficult to undertake. Next slide, please. Thank you. So, as I mentioned, the government interference. The next one, please. Yes, and other examples of risks, they said, as mentioned, is persecution from law enforcement agencies, and even sometimes they face risks that are not only offline, some of them can also be online because many of the young activists work a lot online these days, and sometimes they receive threats, on social media, and this work they do definitely has a big impact and effect on their mental health, which is damaging to them and also their reputation. So it's very difficult for them to conduct the work that they do and the impact they would like to have in their communities and in their society. Next slide, please. Thank you. Another important aspect that was highlighted is as it regards to funding. Many of the youth organizations say that they either don't have sufficient funds to undertake the work that they do, or even if they do have access to funding, many times this funding tend to be very restrictive. So many times donors require a lot of bureaucratic processes. The application processes are very long, very difficult to understand, and even sometimes the young activists and their organizations are more informal. So it means that they really don't have the technical expertise or the capacity to even dedicate so much time or energy into long reports or long forms they have to fill. So they just find like, receiving funding from donors, even though they exist, can be very difficult because they either don't match the criteria or they don't even understand the processes. So many times their work is being restricted because they lack access to funding. And this is one of the issues they really highlighted. Thank you. The next slide, please. Yes, as I said before, bureaucracy, very tedious, slow, it's inflexible. And also they talked about the unbalance in power, where basically the power dynamics of, being youth activists, sometimes you're not taken seriously and the work that you do is not seen as something very relevant because you're young or they think you're inexperienced. And they're also not really heard because of the way young activists are perceived in society, like troublemakers, and they don't listen to them. Thank you. And then finally, for the conclusion, so for me and for the activists that I engaged with, it was very enriching in the sense that it was interesting to bring different activists from different countries, as I said, 5 countries, and to allow them to have a space to speak freely, to share their experiences, their concerns, the gaps that they see in safeguarding, the issues they face as youth activists, either on their health, the funding issues that they encounter. It was just a space for them to really share their experiences. And also, this research, of course, is solely based on a qualitative approach, basically hearing their experiences and understanding the issues they face. And this is a very important topic because we know that in the past few years, there has been a trend or a persistent trend of silencing young people's voices or human rights activists' voices and the movement that they lead. And the concept or the phenomenon of shrinking of civic space has been continuous, not only even in countries that I've studied, in this case in West Africa or Southern Africa, but also in many countries, even around Europe and even in the Americas. So this is not only a regional issue, but rather a global issue that should be taken really seriously. And we know that, based on this global trend of anti-democratic movements that are not allowing young people or even civil society organizations to work on the issues they want to work on because they don't have the space or an enabling environment that allows them to work. It makes it really hard for them to create the change or the long-lasting change they would like to see. So I would love to also make a call to action if there are donor organizations or the international community to really think of ways to better support and resource young activists as it comes to funding, because this is an issue they really face, and sometimes it can really hamper or hinder the work to do because they don't have enough funding enlarge the scope of their work. So I hope this presentation has been very useful and interesting. You can also get access to the report where I in detail more of the country situation and analysis of the findings. And also I'm able to share the videos of the recording and how the sessions went, as well as the amazing bios of the 12 activists that volunteered and participated in this research. I would like to once again say thank you to them. And there is definitely a slide where you can see more about them and the bios, and I invite you to have a look at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pelumi. And as a reminder, you can read Pelumi's final report outlining her findings in the youth corner of the platform, as well as the bios of the activists. So Pelumi, just some questions for you now. From your experience hosting the co-creation workshops, you mentioned some of the biggest concerns and sentiments youth expressed regarding shrinking civic spaces, that being lack of funding and lack of government support, as well as feelings of discouragement. So what are some steps the private sector and business associations can take to encourage participatory action and the opening of these civic spaces?
Thank you very much for the question. Yes, I'm very happy that you highlighted the question from the perspective of the private sector, because this is not only, demanding accountability from the government, but every stakeholder, even private sector stakeholders, should be involved in this process. Understanding that one of the issues that they complained about was funding, I think this is a big role that, in this case, the private sector could play in facilitating funding that is non-restrictive, that understands the conditions in which the young activists work in. For example, when they need funding immediately, for example, with the NSAS protest, these were like needs that were on the ground in the moment, and they needed like a faster response and agile, funding mechanism that could allow them to access the funding in a way that they can really continue the work we're doing and support the other activists on the ground. So I think this is an open call and a space for the private sector to really take on that, provide help for the funding for young people if, the public sector isn't as agile. And I think the private sector could be more agile in that sense. And young people will be very happy with that.
Thanks, Pelumi. And how do you think that we can better encourage this partnership and collaboration between the government and the private sector in combating this large issue? The civic spaces are still very closed in the countries that you did work in. So what do you recommend for collaboration in this space?
Yes, definitely. Collaborative efforts is always like the route to go and the way to go about it. I think it's also putting pressure on government. Of course, it depends on which government, they might be more receptive or not. But I do think the private sector can use their voice also to be allies with activists, and also share their sentiment of a more equal and just world. But not only simple posts on social media supporting the cause, but actually, engaging and calling on young people to, sit at the table and hear the perspective and see ways where they can also, engage with young people, either on the work they do in their companies in the private sector, but also I think it's mostly for them to use their power to engage and put pressure on the government in a way that it would kind of force the government to reconsider or rethink the measures that are putting in place. And I think the more people that join the causes that young people are working on, or just activists are working on, the more buy-in we can get from different stakeholders on different levels.
Definitely, I agree completely, Pelumi. Thank you so much for your presentation, and we're really looking forward to reading your final report. Thank you. And now I will pass it over to my colleague Ritika Singh to introduce the final youth leader.